Hello, welcome to OctopusDo. I'm Christian Ross, and you are in the right place to learn about jewelry making. So don't forget to subscribe and click on the notification below so that you'll know when new videos come out. The technique we're going to talk about today is chainmail. And I'm not talking about the letters that you have to pass along and anyway, sorry, bad joke. We're talking about chainmail, which is basically a jewelry making technique that has been developed based on the techniques of making armor, you know, knights and Robin Hood and Ivanhoe and the whole bit. But taking those techniques of using rings and joining them to other rings to make chains, to make three-dimensional objects, so many different things, it's still called chainmail. If you are searching for chainmail and chainmail tutorials, you may find different spellings. It's because nobody can really decide on how to officially spell chainmail. You'll find it as two words, C-H-A-I-N space M-A-I-L-L-E, or one word, chainmail. Take those and squish them together. And other variations, but I'm not going to go into all of that. Don't be surprised if you have to use alternative spellings to find things. You can also find chainmail and tutorials under the name of the weave that you make out of it, and we'll get into more of that later. No matter the weave that you are putting together in chainmail, all it really is comprised of is different individual interlocking rings. So one ring at a time will get you whatever pattern you're trying to make as long as you put them together in the right order. People that come up to me and they say, well, how do you do really big pieces? And I don't have the patience for that, or I can never make something so big or elaborate. All I say is this: how do you eat an elephant? Well, the answer is one bite at a time. So how do you make chainmail? One ring at a time. Anyway, the very first thing that you need to know when making chainmail is how to open and close jump rings. This is the most important thing in chainmail because if you don't do this correctly, everything else is just going to get harder. So I'm going to go over how I open and close jump rings. If you've heard about this before, just bear with me, maybe skip ahead if you want, but I'll give you my technique. And by the way, I'm a little bit backwards from a lot of people. I'll explain that in just a second. Each ring in chainmail is called a jump ring. You'll see that in other jewelry making techniques. You'll use a jump ring to attach a clasp to a piece, or just for several different things to add a space in your designs. So basically a jump ring is a jewelry ring that has a split in it. It doesn't overlap like a key ring. The ends just kind of butt up next to each other. And in chainmail armor and things like that, that's also called butted rings. So you can see the split right there. Now, if I were to open this by pulling on the sides, this is never, ever, ever going to go back and be round again. Sorry, it's just not going to happen. That's because metal has a quality called springback. When you bend metal, if you've ever noticed, it'll open back up just a little bit. So you push it together and it kind of opens. And you push it together, it kind of opens. That's called springback. If you're coiling wire, you got to be careful about springback, because if you let go of the end of that wire that you're coiling, it's going to flip around and hit you in the back of the hand, and that can be quite painful. So be careful about that. But springback works for rings as well. So what I'm talking about is when I push this together, You see that? It was right. It's closed, yes? No, it's not, because you're never going to be able to overcome the spring back by going back and forth like that. So what you do when you're opening chainmail rings is you have to open them front to back. So when I teach in front of large groups of people, there's hand gestures. Anyway, so I'll do it small for you guys. Basically, you have a jump ring like this, and when you open it, you go this way with your jump ring. And what that does is when you're going back, you can bend it a little bit further and it springs back and closes exactly where you need it to go. I'll show you this on my little jump ring, my little big jump ring here. Push one side up and one side down. So I have a nice big opening here. Look at that. So when I close this, I go past the point and let go. Nope, that was a little too far. It didn't quite make it back. So I go past again and past again until it lines up. And you can tell that it is lined up. Like so. There you go. Now, a good set of magnification could be very important. So if you have a visor or readers or glasses or anything like that where you can use those to really zoom in and look and see if your rings are closed, it's very handy. If you happen to be without your magnification and you're trying to see if your rings are completely closed, what you can do is after you've closed them, run your fingers along that and you'll be able to feel if they're not completely closed. So that comes in handy. That becomes part of my rhythm when I'm working with chainmail. After I close it, I just automatically, before I set the ring down, will touch it and set it down. The pliers that I like to use for chainmail, to me, depend on the size of the jump rings that I'm using. So my fingers worked really well as a demonstration for those large rings, but if I'm working with teeny tiny rings, then I like to use a chain nose plier and a bent chain nose plier. Different chainmail artists use different pliers, so really I encourage you to, play around with your different pliers and see what feels best for you and what you're most comfortable with and go with that. But I like these guys specifically because the chain nose, it's your standard, flat on the inside with a point. I like the little point on that. I can grab things at that little bitty point, or I can turn my plier that way and support a lot of the metal of the ring. And then the same thing with my bent chain nose. Again, I can use the point or I can use the curved side and support the metal of my ring. And that's really what's important. You don't want to come in like that from the side and like that, because on this, do you see how little of that metal is being supported by your pliers? What happens when you start twisting this is you could end up deforming that ring and making it hard to go back into a circle again. So see, it doesn't line up anymore because the wire bent, the wire of the ring bent in a way it was not supposed to, because I wasn't fully supporting it. So if you come in, I'll grab another ring here. If you come in and support that metal like so, and on this side, and twist, there you go, move back and forth, you end up with a circular ring, and it stays nice and shiny. When using any type of coated metal or coated jump ring, many artists will choose to use tools that have been dipped in like a plastidip or a tool dip, something like that, so that they don't mar their rings. Some artists will use a nylon jaw plier, but I find that that makes the pliers very slippery and I end up dropping too many rings, and it's more trouble really to me than it's worth. My advice to you is to find the pair of pliers that are comfortable to you, and then just watching your grip so that you don't really squish down. So you don't have a death grip on your pliers, so that you're not biting into those rings. If you're really having a hard time with that and you seem to over grip, then I would suggest going with a stronger metal until you really get that worked out, or going with a metal that's a solid metal and not plated, so it can be cleaned and buffed out without taking that top layer off. But once you get the hang of how hard you can squeeze onto your wire, then you can use anything from a coated aluminum to an enameled copper to a niobium, anything like that, and not get tool marks in your pieces. So just to point out something, you know how I said earlier that I was backwards from a lot of people? I don't know if you noticed that, but when I was opening and closing my jump ring here, I generally have the split inside toward me, which means when I open, I'm raising my wrist. So I'm here and I open, so one side is coming up. That's a little different from what a lot of people do, which is they will open and close their jump rings from this side, meaning that the opening is facing away from them. Now really, it's just a matter of personal preference. The reason I do that is because I actually started making chainmail, like the big hauberks and the suits and the things like that, with larger gauge stainless steel wire in your 16 gauge and your 14 gauge and your 12 gauge and things like that. And I found it easier on my wrists to use my arm as a lever to open, as opposed to trying to use my wrists as a lever. Totally up to you how you want to do that. Just when you find a method, stick with it and you'll get a good rhythm going. The other thing I want to point out is when you're opening several jump rings at once, well, you still have to do it one at a time, sorry. Try to always open with one side up and the other side down in the same direction. What I like to do is when I open my jump rings, like so, I have this side is down and this side is up, and the opening is pointing toward me. The reason I do that is so that I come back and I start weaving all of these together. When I pick them up by the high side, like this, and I can weave into my jewelry. So I'll show you what I'm talking about here. I've got a closed jump ring that I'm starting with, and I use this point and pick it up. So I've used the open jump ring to pick up the closed jump ring, and now I have to go in and close that second jump ring. This is where I'm talking about it's very handy to have the opening toward me, because I can just come in here and the tips of my pliers don't really get in the way, and I support the metal and just go back and forth until that's closed, and voila. I have 2 linked chainmail rings. There we go. So then you just keep going. I'll add a pink one so you can see what I'm doing. I just come over here and scoop up the end like so, and then close that ring as well. So guess what? That's all it takes to start making chainmail. This particular weave is called a link-in-link or a one-in-one link. And that's because each chainmail ring has one more going into it. So this is a one-in-one link. I'll show you what that looks like with smaller rings. So you could make a chain just like this, taking your jump rings and going one ring into one ring into one ring as long as you like. And that would be a very pretty chain, especially in different colors. You could vary the colors, you could use textured rings. It could be really exciting. Well, if you just took this simple technique and you doubled up on your rings, this is a 2-in-2 link. Well, you can also get really fancy and do 3-in-3. The only thing that you have to look out for when you're adding multiple rings in the same area is make sure that each ring that you add doesn't cross over the one next to it, because then you end up with a completely different pattern. This one has each ring that's in the same plane right next to each other, not going through each other. I hope you enjoyed my level 0 on chainmail jewelry making. Tune in for progressive works. We'll do a few more weaves and really have a lot of fun with it. If you enjoyed this, click like and leave me a comment below. And if you have any questions, definitely leave those, any comments. I love reading your comments. And so yeah, now you know. Go make something.